There is another world, a place of wonder, fantastic creatures and places, people and their stories. It is glimpsed only in childhood fantasy, or in dreams you can't quite remember. This is one of those dreams. This is a story from the Veilworld. Wodehouse had a real weakness for cheese. He was far older than cheese, of course. He'd been around since before the first cow had been let out of the woods. But something about the tang of fermented milk turned solid was addictive to him. Now, by the time cheese-making was common in Karelia, there were people all around. And Wodehouse never did take the time to make cheese, our cheese at least, himself. No, Wodehouse was a good man, but he did have a soft spot for cheese, and he often went to strange lengths to lay his hands on it. As I mentioned, Wodehouse was old, even by those young days in Karelian history, when towns were just starting to thrive up and down the coast and on the rivers. You don't become that old by stealing, or by lying and cheating. Wodehouse was a man of his word. Never stole anything from a human except for their lives, never gave them anything less than kindness or death, or both. It was early spring, before the cows began calving, so the milk hadn't begun running yet. The winter was just beginning to turn, but there was still ice everywhere, and the plants had not yet broken up through the soil. Wodehouse came to a little village called Obor, or at least that's how I've heard it named, and decided to find a local cheesemaker to satisfy his craving for the stuff. It had been a hard winter, and there weren't fish in the streams yet, or vegetables in the garden, or hay left for the cows. The only sign that winter was ending was that the days were finally getting longer, and the sun would actually climb up over the horizon, almost, before dipping back down and disappearing again. The cheesemaker there had long since sold his last wares, and the family was living on the cheese they had left, nibbling at a solitary wheel until the sun returned. Wodehouse requested it, of course, but they wouldn't part with it at any price. "It's not worth our lives, sir," the pressed cheeseman declared. "Even if you were Wodehouse, I couldn't sell it to you." We have to forgive the cheeseman his impudence a little here. Wodehouse had a coat on over his tattoos, and he had changed his face so that the scars wouldn't show. "Maybe I can capture Wodehouse's help," he replied. "What do you need instead?" The cheesemaker laughed. "My daughter is sick, the village is starving, and you ask me what I need? Food, shelter, shorter winters, longer summers, reindeer that give milk like a cow, the power to melt snow." "And for that, you would give me the remainder of your cheese?" Wodehouse replied. Yes. The cheeseman's face was growing pale. You cannot name Wodehouse too few times in a conversation concerning exchange. "Done then, sir," Wodehouse shouted, and his cloak melted away and the scars returned. "I will return shortly." The cheesemaker begged him to take the cheese and be done with it, but as I have mentioned, Wodehouse was, and is, a man of his word. He set off that evening under the northern lights. Now, as you know, those lights aren't just splashes of color in the sky. They are the splashes of color from women's dreams. Wodehouse knew that, clearly, but he is somewhat wiser than most men when it comes to the female sex. As he stood at the edge of the village, and the lights began to bleed across the sky, he did not run towards them, like Sunio, and get burned up, or climb towards them like Sivani. No, he just stood at the edge of the village and beckoned. Then he turned his back and didn't move. Sure enough, the tendrils of light came down and wrapped up around him, and so he turned over and let them pick him up and carry him into the air. Those lights aren't really part of our world. Like Sivani found, they're always just a little bit above where we are. But if they come down to you and carry you to where they are, well, that's a different story. They live in the land of the sun. Wodehouse pulled one of his tattoos up over his eyelids as the lights enfolded him. It was a good thing, too, or he would have gone blind in the sky there as they pulled him away from our world to theirs. After he crossed to the other side, he saw the landscape. Rivers running purple, a green velvet sky, trees of orange and silver bark with white leaves. There is an orchard in that country, untended by any keeper. There is no need. The plants there entirely tend to themselves. Wodehouse knew it well, for it was there that he had first eaten the rina blossoms, and gotten the scars on his tongue and lips and nose. It is an orchard full of fruit, apples, plums, and the rowan tree, with vines of grapes and thickets of berry bramble. But in that orchard the remarkable items are not the fruits, but the seeds. One pit planted in our world fills 1,000 acres with harvest. One sapling transplanted grows to be 10,000 trees. But the fruit in that land is poison. Wodehouse walked to a rina tree and bowed first to show his appreciation. Then he licked his hands and plucked 2 berries from a marshy spot. Huge golden berries, the size of your fist and filled with light. When the berries felt the saliva, they began to ooze out their poison, a sweet smell of autumn, and of fire, and of spiced and scented wines. And he clutched one in each hand and squeezed. The berries of that country do not take to squeezing, and so they began to tremble and heat, until Wodehouse was holding white-hot balls of flame. The saliva on his hands kept him from burning, though, and transferred the fire into his blood, where it coursed through him and marked all the traces of his veins. He squeezed harder, until the berries couldn't get any hotter. And so they began to deflate, little by little, as the juice flowed into him with the fire, until his eyes began to blaze and the skin beneath his cheekbones split open and spouted smoke. But when he was finished and he opened his hands, he found there dozens of tiny seeds, clean and crisp and ready for the earth. "That's for the summers and winters, and for the food," Wodehouse said. He put one of the seeds on the scar on his tongue and swallowed it, and the flames and smoke cleared from his body, and his cheeks closed back up. "Now for the daughter, and shelter, and for the melting of snow."